Hello friends, today we will discuss about a very interesting topic, that is the nature and types of communication. What do we mean by communication? Communication is the flow of information, the flow of a message from one person to at least another through a channel, and in the process there is an encoding of information, passing the information through a channel, decoding the information at the receiver's end, and finally a feedback which completes the loop. So, we are now going to focus on not the process of communication, but the nature of communication. Communication is essentially seen in very simple terms, in relatively simple terms, by the layman. The concept of communication is seen and interpreted differently by laymen and by psychologists. For a layman, what we had initially talked about, communication being a process involving a sender, a receiver, a message and a channel, more or less captures the entire essence of the concept of communication. But a psychologist understands the complexities and the nuances in the entire communication process. There is complexity in communication as seen by psychologists because we are continually engaged in it. Communication is not a one-off thing. We are continuously being bombarded by information from different sides. There is communication happening at every point in time, at every moment, continuously. So, this brings in a degree of complexity, a very high degree of complexity into understanding the entire process of communication, because even while we are trying to understand it, we are engaging in it. There is an entire psychosocial field in which we are continuously interacting. So, complexity becomes ingrained into communication process. Because communication involves a sender and at least one or more receivers, communication has been seen by psychologists as more of a transaction. Communication is a transaction. There is something that is exchanged, something given, something taken. So, communication process is a transaction and it essentially requires for the message to be delivered. There is a sender and there has to be a receiver for communication to actually happen. Let us assume or imagine a situation where there are two people, Akash and Aishwarya. Akash is sitting in a room reading the newspaper. Aishwarya walks in and says hi. Now, in this situation there can be two possible reactions. One, when Aishwarya says hi, Akash looks up and responds with a hello or a hi or how are you or a good morning. So, what is happening? Aishwarya, the sender, has sent a message hi, and this has travelled to the receiver Akash, and Aishwarya is aware that the receiver has received it because there has been a feedback. Akash responds and says, hello, how are you, good morning. So, there is a response to the message that has been sent out by the sender. So, the communication process is complete. Now, the same situation, let us look at it in a slightly different way. Aishwarya walks in, Akash is reading his paper, he is so totally engrossed in a particular article that he is reading that he does not notice her presence. He does not notice that Aishwarya has walked into the room. Aishwarya says hi and walks on. Akash who hasn't even recognized, seen that Aishwarya has walked in, does not respond. So, in this situation, do we say that Aishwarya saying hi to Akash, has the message been communicated or not? Is there a communication or not? Essentially, what psychologists say is, when there is no receipt of a message, when the receiver has not received the message, communication has not happened. Take the example of a notice which is put up on a notice board. If no one looks at that notice board, has a particular information been communicated? No. The message is communicated only when there is at least one receiver to receive the message, to assimilate it and respond to it in some manner. The response may be overt, the response may be seen, the response may be active, or the response may also be passive. Notice, an information put up as notice in a notice board, may react to it by passing on the message to someone else. B may react to it in terms of asking a query or asking a question with respect to the notice. C may just read it and walk off. In C's case, there has been a response, but it is a passive response, as in the sender is not really receiving any cues whether the communication has taken place or not. But though the response is not overt, the response is not visible, communication has happened because C has read and has understood what is written and put up on the notice board. So, essentially we are looking at communication as a transaction between individuals. When we say communication is a transaction, it immediately highlights and brings into focus the role of feedback. How would college authorities know that a particular piece of information disseminated through the notice board has been read, understood and relayed among students? Even if a handful of students stand there and read the notice board, or if a faculty member goes to the class and tells the students, please go and look at the notice board, there is something important put up there. So, it could be either a direct transaction or it could be a transaction where the entire chain is not clearly, evidently visible. In either cases, feedback becomes an important part of the mechanism to understand how effectively communication has happened. If the college authorities see a few students standing and reading the notice, or if the college authorities get to know that students have responded in a particular class to the faculty members' suggestion of reading what's on the notice board, that in itself is feedback with respect to the communication that has happened or the flow of information from college authorities to students. See, in this case, we are looking at a very specific form of communication. It is a communication which is written in nature. It is a communication from one to many, and despite being a communication form where notice is simply put up on the notice board and college looks for some kind of cues to assume that information has been disseminated, this is still communication if and only if at least one student or one other person sees and responds or sees what is given on the notice board. In the context of, say, an oral communication, usually the feedback is instantaneous. We say something, immediately people react. We ask a question, immediately we get a response. The response could be in terms of answering the question we raise, or it could be in terms of another question to our question. But in either case, the sender is assured that the message has been delivered. the receiver has understood that something has been conveyed, something was said. So, communication is a transaction with feedback forming a very important part of this transaction process. So, we are essentially looking at communication as a process in a social context. Communication in the backdrop of a social system. Communication as part of social relationships. When we talk in terms of communication as being part of social system, what are we actually referring to? How does a social system work? A country, a race, a culture, a family, a group of people coming together for something common. Whenever there are a group of people with some commonality in them which binds them together, communication becomes the essence or the network on which an entire social system is based. Communication, exchange of information on a continuous basis is what feeds a social system. Social systems thrive on the network of communication that exists within the individual members of a social system. So, communication binds together and ensures existence of social systems. Communication ensures there are social relationships and ensures the fundamental nature of human beings, that is, man being a social animal. For man to exist, he or she needs to communicate with others, and hence communication becomes the fundamental building block for a social system. If we narrow down our view, social system being large or being a larger plane on which we understand communication process, a slightly smaller plane happens to be, a smaller framework happens to be interpersonal relationships. Communication therefore is the essential thread that ensures effectiveness in interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal behavior influences the effectiveness and the way message is communicated between people. The same message of there has been a crisis because of which college will not be open for another week. The same message can be conveyed between two people in different ways based on interpersonal behavior. If this is a message that is conveyed from an authority to the students, it would take the form of a written communication or a formal oral declaration. If the same message is passed on between two friends, the language would differ, the tone would differ, and what follows that the reaction would also be totally different. So, communication is influenced by interpersonal behavior. When the communication is between two friends, it would probably be on the lines of there is some problem and so college is going to extend the vacation for another week, which means we are going to have more free time. So, the message is being interpreted in the context of the interpersonal behavior of two friends who would like to interpret the message as additional time for them to spend together on things other than attending college. Whereas, when the same message is between a superior and a subordinate or between a person of formal authority and a recipient, the tone and the implication is also totally different. When a college authority tells a student, the implication there is hence the classes will commence 1 week later, There would probably be changes in terms of the number of holidays being given subsequently. So, these are the kind of implications the same message would have in a different interpersonal context. So, the effectiveness and the impact of a particular message would differ based on the interpersonal behavior of the people at the two ends of the communication channel. While language forms a very important part of communication, especially in face-to-face communication, non-verbal cues have a lot of influence on how the message is passed on and interpreted. The body language and gestures convey a whole lot of meaning over and above what the actual words seem to convey. While the words connote a certain message, based on the body language, the message is interpreted differently in different contexts. The same sentence may be seen as an indication of something to be celebrated or something to be wary of, to take guard, based on the body language of the sender of the message. So, non-verbal cues also determine the nature of communication process. While non-verbal cues give a lot of important pointers, indicators to the receiver as to the essence behind a message being conveyed, language still forms an important part of communication. Non-verbal cues come into play only when there is a face-to-face interaction, whereas language forms the essential basis on which the entire field of communication rests. So, language is a very important source of information as well as misinformation in the communication process. Psycholinguistics hence focuses on language and the impact of language within the psychological implications of what a language connotes, what a message in a particular language connotes to a person. So, human behavior and influence of language on behavior is a very important field which contributes towards our understanding of communication process. Language also is seen and understood in the context of cognition to understand communication. What do we mean? When we say cognition, we are talking about higher order processes like thinking and impact of language in the way we think, having an effect on how a message is communicated or interpreted. We are all trained in a particular language right since childhood, and this language influences the way we think, the way we interpret certain words, certain cues, certain phrases. Thereby, language is going to create a very important impact in the communication process. A native understands things differently versus someone who is not native to the language interpreting the same message and understanding it in a different context. So, language has a very important role to play in communication process. When we think, we tend to think in a language. We tend to think in terms of words, phrases and sentences. So, essentially we think, interpret and communicate through the medium of language. So, the nature of communication is affected by the language and linguistic differences as well. Psychologists have over the years used several tests like the word association test, the semantic differential test to understand the implications of the choice of words in a particular language to communicate a particular message? How is a message interpreted based on the kind of words used? Semantic differential and word association tests have been used several times to understand the shades of meaning that each individual seems to carry with a particular language. So, communication is a process which is highly complex and needs to be understood in the context of a social system as being influenced by verbal and non-verbal cues, and as being completed if and only if there is a recipient to the message that a particular sender delivers. We will now look at the different types of communication that we see in and around us. There are several ways in which we can understand and classify communication, different kinds of communication. One way of looking at it is in terms of the channel. Is it written? Is it oral? Is it delivered through a telephone? Is it delivered face to face? Is it one to many? Is it one to one? Different kinds of communication happen parallelly all around us. One way of looking at communication is to see if it is a two-way communication process or a one-way communication. When there are two people involved in a dialogue, or when someone says and gets a response, it is a two-way communication process. But let us assume a different situation. There is a textbook you are reading. Now, is the textbook trying to tell you something? Do you understand and react to it? Do you read something on the page and think about it, question it? If we do that, then yes, there is a communication happening. However, this is a different kind of communication or a one-way communication process. So, fundamentally a one-way communication process, the direction of communication is only from A to B. In a two-way communication process, however, the message travels from A to B and there is also a response carried back from B to A and so on and so forth. The process continues. So, communication could either be one-way or two-way. In the work context, communication can also be seen as upward, downward or lateral communication. So, when we are talking about kinds of communication, we refer to upward communication or downward communication in terms of the relationship between the two participants in the communication process. When a message is passed on from someone of a higher status to a lower status, then it is a downward communication process. When the message in turn is passed on from a lower status person to a higher status person, it is upward communication. To give an example, at work, when the boss gives a message or when the boss gives an instruction, it is downward communication. When the subordinate acts upon it and responds and tells him, sir, the work is done, or sir, I am going to go and complete the work, it is an upward communication from a lower level person to a higher level person. There is a third kind, a third category, that is lateral communication. In lateral communication, in terms of position and status, the two participants in the communication process, that is the sender and receiver, are usually occupying the same level. In terms of position and status, they are similar. So, in lateral communication, the information is moving from one person to another without an impact of a difference in position or a difference in status. The examples so far which we have been dealing with to try and understand upward communication, downward communication and lateral communication have all been in the context of formal dissemination of information. That is, they are examples that we have looked at where there is a clear authority for the person to communicate the message. When the boss tells the subordinate to do something, the superior has authority to pass on the message. Similarly, when the subordinate responds, the subordinate has the right to, or the subordinate is bound to respond and show that he or she has understood the message. There is, however, a different kind of communication through which lot of information gets disseminated in social networks. In fact, more than formal communication, informal communication channels disseminate information a whole lot faster, and social relationships thrive on this informal passing on of messages. The informal communication channels are broadly referred to as grapevine. Here, the message passes on from one to another irrespective of whether the message is going to the intended recipient or not. So, and in a grapevine, the dissemination of information naturally happens much faster than a formal communication process. So, we are looking at a different kind of communication here, that is an informal communication process. Let us recollect that we have looked at different kinds of communication in terms of the channel of communication used. We said there could be oral or there could be written forms of communication. With the rapid advances in technology, new forms of communication have opened up in terms of email and messages or information posted through social networks. This has added a new dimension to the complex area of study, that is communication. Emails have ensured that communication happens very rapidly. Written communication takes place from one to one or one to many very rapidly, compressing the time element involved in the communication channel. On the other hand, social networks have opened up a totally new front. This is a platform where a whole lot of information is just posted, and irrespective of the kind of recipients the sender may or may not have in mind. Social networks have brought focus to a form of communication from one to many, where information dissemination is done with a specific purpose at the sender's end, but the impact cannot really be gauged as to whether it has reached its intended audience or not. So, we have been looking at various kinds of communication that happen in and around us.